Welcome to the Revival Method podcast, where we teach you actionable steps that you can take to start moving, thinking, and feeling better. I always ruin this portion. That's why I always have the guests do it for me. Hampton, can you go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Well, my name is Hampton. My brand and channel is called Hybrid Calisthenics. I enunciated that because in one podcast I said Chand and Brannel, and it's actually on my. I took that clip. I like the clip, but I do bodyweight exercise. I talk with people about the motivation behind exercise, and we try to make exercise accessible to people in different forms. And we try to give different options for people, either if they are limited somehow by money, somehow by information, just because there are some things there. And we try to get people healthy, fit, and strong with just their bodies and gravity, and then they can take that and run with it however they like.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I mean, everybody has like a catalyst as to why they go down the route of maybe starting a channel, starting a business. I mean, you and I were talking off air on how hard business can be. So what was like the driving force to start becoming an asset to those people looking to move and feel their best?
Well, it's interesting because I talked about this a little bit off air, but like I have this story that I bring up. I get this question a fair amount. It's interesting because I feel like most people who know my content somewhat would believe me if I said I didn't do this for money, right? But I think about it. I believe in trying to be honest whenever possible, and I did it for money. And I ended up, that changed, right? I started for money, not in a greed way, but because I needed some way to make some extra money on the side. And at the time I was at home, right? And I was like, man, I was taking care of a family member, and I was like, I really need some way to make like a side hustle to make some extra income on the side. And I thought I would start doing social media and I would sell a course or something, a good one to actually help people. My goal was never to, just take the money and run, but it was to do a business, right? But I remember getting this first comment on Facebook, right? And I've told this story a couple times, and it seems almost too made up, but the story is no less true than the first time I told it. It's like there was this comment I saw. I actually ran an ad on Facebook because I didn't know how to. So the idea of organic reach and posting something and having it go to people without paying them for, like, I didn't understand that. I didn't understand that part. So I had to pay like $5 a day or something. Circulated a video, and I got an actual comment from someone, and that person said, "Wow, Hampton, this is really helpful. Thank you for sharing. I will use this. I'm also taking care of my mom," because that's what I was doing at the time.
Okay.
I'll report back. And his name was Ken, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" So it's like that was the catalyst, I would say, where I was like, "Interesting. So I can reach real people this way, and the information I share can matter to that person." Now, I'm fully aware that there's like people that will comment, "Oh, this is life changing," and then like forget about it the next day, right? So like, I'm like, I don't want to self-aggrandize that, but that definitely was a link where I felt where there was a true realization or the beginning of it, that I was like, when I speak, this can connect with people in the outside world too, beyond just a way to make money. Of course, that like most people who do this full time usually have to make some kind of money out of it, but this is an interesting thing to work in. We can actually connect with people. And that was really the catalyst for a lot of things I did subsequently.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people assume what we do is just turning on a camera and just winging it. But
Yeah.
if they actually were to do it themselves, they would realize all the bloopers and the outtakes of you screaming at the camera, like, I just can't nail this line, or I can't say these things.
Right.
And I'm right there with you with the thought process that this is such a unique opportunity where it's a win-win on both sides, where if I give you my best, I give you my knowledge in a way that you know how to absorb it, and you take it and run with it. Yes, I get paid, but your life can actually change as well. And I love what you do is maybe I don't know, maybe I'm not alone, clearly I'm not, but when I'm watching your videos, it's just, I think to myself, there's not a person that's watching this that's going to be left in confusion, because you are so good at breaking it down in a way that everyone should understand. And I'm curious, like, how did you gain that skill?
So this is interesting because maybe you get this impression through, of course, you've been talking with me for a little bit before we hit record, but the audience might be able to listen to this. I'm a fairly long-winded person, right? Like,
Awesome.
yeah, there's been some podcasts where this person, the host, I assume, had this like long list of questions, and they got to ask three of them. Okay, that's because it's like the question starts with like, why do you start hybrid calisthenics? And like an hour later, it's like, and that's my favorite dog, and that's why, right? So and then like, Chinese did invent noodles, and I will not change my mind on that, right? So I naturally speak in like podcast format, but when I started the idea of like, well, and it was me actually turning on the camera and winging it, but eventually it really did turn into, I was like, well, maybe I will start thinking about what I'm going to say before I turn on the camera. And when I started doing that, I started thinking, well, I realized there was a limit to what I could explain well in 1 minute. So that was the things like because at the time I didn't have that many followers or anything, and I was sharing with my friends. So if I made a video and I said hello my friend, it was usually to my friend, right? And I said, if I explain this in 1 minute, will they actually understand? Will they actually benefit? Not will people view it, but will they actually understand, or are they going to have a bunch of follow-up questions? So they usually have a bunch of follow-up questions, and that really started to challenge this thing. Have you heard like the idea that if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough?
Yeah.
Right. So I was like, well, it's going to take me some time to understand things simply. And that actually changed the way I speak, because now when I have a verbose idea in my brain, I'm like, what's an easy way I can say this? Now, I'm not always successful, right? There are some times where I send something out and I thought it made sense. I'm like, or like sometimes I'm like, that probably isn't the best. And people understand. And sometimes I'm like, that probably isn't the best. And then nobody understands. Like, then there's like all these questions like, okay, I'll follow up. I'll make a sequel on this. Right. um, and diving a little bit deeper, I also have, it's a dislike of being misunderstood. I definitely don't want to say something that I don't mean any, like, worst case scenarios. Like, I don't want to say something that I have no malice towards, and someone interprets it that way. Now,
Yeah.
to be completely fair to myself and other people who have experienced that, sometimes it's not entirely your fault. People interpret things how they want, right? But I always want to reduce that, right? Because like there's kind of a thing with internet where and here comes a tangent where some people are saying, well, we don't want to be afraid, so we want to be unapologetic, which I understand that. I get it. Like if you say what you mean and you really believe it and you don't want to hurt people and you want to help people, wonderful. But if I'm going to spend 5 hours making this video, if I can spend 50 hours making this video, and I could add 2 or 3 lines, right? Usually just true things where it's like, hey, I like this, but you don't have to do it, right? And that can help an extra 5% of people, an extra 5,000, 10,000 people that watch it. Why wouldn't I? Right. So if I'm going to spend all this time, why would I want to maximize all of it by giving some extra clarity of what I mean, and just so people watching can really benefit instead of thinking I meant something else?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious. So with you helping as many people as you do and creating content for them, what do you think is like one of the biggest roadblocks that people face when you're talking to them? I mean, that's an ambiguous question intentionally. Take it however you want.
The biggest roadblock is onboarding for most people, I would say.
Really?
Onboarding as in getting started, right? So, I when I made my fitness routine, I have two. So it's on the website, and I had two introduction videos, and this is progressive calisthenics. So you understand this concept, and most people watching this will understand. Where it's the idea of like, your push up isn't just a push up. You can break it down into wall push up, incline push up, advanced incline push up, knee push up. Like they're like you can scale the push up. They can go towards like one arm push ups. There's easier and harder versions of that exercise. I did that with a few different exercises, and I realized that I published this, and there were millions of people that have seen it by now. I've seen the stats. And the people that have watched the introduction video, last I checked, it was a couple of years ago, was like 40,000. Right. So I was like, So I was like, and interesting. And because of that, some of them were confused by the idea. I said, well, just watch the introduction video. Right. And this is me learning. Right. I was like, oh, just watch it. Then you would understand. But they didn't want to do it. So fitness is actually two parts that we take for granted. Right. One is actually doing the fitness, doing the things that will change, that will spur the changes in your body, and then, resting and then setting up your body to facilitate those changes. So sleep, diet, lifestyle, the exercise, of course. And then there's also learning about it. That's the part that people take for granted, especially people who are well informed and knowledgeable about it. Not even just like fitness influencers, so to speak, to use the I word there a little bit, but content creators But even as people who are passionate about it, they take it for granted because they like to learn about it. So first you have to learn about it, and then you have to do it, right? Or you can get a coach, right? But a lot of people don't just have a coach, right? So like if you have the ability to get a coach, and you find someone you trust, by all means do that. But even then, the coach still has to teach you those things, kind of, right? So you still have to remember. You usually have to remember the things you're doing, somewhat. So that's the thing. Is people take for granted the part where they have to learn, I think, and that is the part that, see, it's very easy to say, well, here it is, here's the hour long, introduction video. Those who take it and those who are really hungry, they can benefit, and those, it's up to you. Like you're not called to that. Which I get that. Like there's a certain level of that, but I also, if I'm making something, I want to help, right? So I try to make things a little bit friendlier. I try to make things a little bit more succinct, and this goes into your first question. And I try to make it a little bit more understandable and incentivized as to why you might want to do this beyond what you think, right? Because one of the, actually, going to formal education a little bit, one of the things they teach you in personal training is there's like this motivation chart where it's like people, like there's like 6 stages or something, to where it's like most people don't even think they need it, and then they think they might need it but they don't want it, and then like you go through this thing. So there's a lot of roadblocks that are in someone's mind that may not even have to be there, and that affects sales and things. But I'm not even giving, like, I can't sell fitness, really, right? Like fitness is there, like that you can go get, like, in many different forms. But it's small things like, I don't really have a couple hours to spend. You need. I was like, well, you don't need a couple hours. Like, really interesting, right? It's like, I don't have an hour. It's like, you don't need an hour, right? Most people are very surprised with how little. Like, you don't have to do a minimalist workout, but people are surprised with how little they have to do just to keep moving forward, and definitely not to just maintain. It's like it's relatively little, right? Especially if you make them fairly intense sets, right? And it's like, well, I don't have the money for that. It's like, okay, well, you can get pretty healthy, fit, and strong at home. It's like calisthenics doesn't really grow muscle. I was like, well, it depends, right? It can, right? It's like, if I very rarely give very straightforward, but it definitely can. Now, if you want a very specific physique, 100% use weights, dumbbells, the barbells, 100% you can build muscle. Right. And it's like, well, I need to lose weight first. It's like, well, actually, so it's like all these things, like, well, you can actually resistance train while you're in a caloric deficit. It actually helps. It's like, interesting. So it's all these things that are actually unasked questions we have to try to address. These aren't things people will directly present to you. Well, sometimes they will, but you have to kind of like dive in and be like, this is why. Right. And then you can bring people in. Right. And
Yeah.
then once again, some people don't want to do that, and it's fine. It's up to them.
Do you think that so more than half the battle is answering these questions that they're not asking, and in order for them to make the next step towards the behavior change that we're trying to solicit is basically remove the friction, right? So it sounds like, because your approach, I love it, and it's similar to what I do as well, is just you kind of take away every excuse and you give them some type of strength to lean on, where it's like, I only have 15 minutes. Great. I can make you a 10-minute routine right now. Yeah, I
Right.
really don't have any equipment. Do you have books at home? Cool. We could do a modified push-up right now. Do you
Right.
have a wall? Do you have a counter? And I think that that is actually very empowering. And
Right.
on top of that, I think that your approach, I mean, it really shows through your videos, is you're friendly. And with my working with my one-on-one clients, is I think that's another appeal that I have as well, is like, people are under the assumption that exercise with getting enough results is like no pain, no gain. People are throwing weights around. And it's like super intimidating when it's like, no, like exercise is literally a part of your health. Like, you need to be able to have this in your life.
Right. Well, it is interesting, and I think someone mentioned this to me once, and I've been thinking about it ever since, because it makes a lot of sense. Because we, I always try to find the foundation to the thing that I currently think, and then when I find the underlying factor beneath that, I consider myself to have advanced. So, like, all the things I mentioned, like convincing some, doing that, most of those would be aligned if they were already motivated to do it. And something that makes people actually feel motivated to do it, that I've noticed, is when you give them an exercise that they can try and they see the benefit from that. They actually see the thing happen. This still happens with me, someone who does fitness in various forms for a living, right? I'm like, okay, I guess I'll do, the toe curls, or like, the face pulls, or whatever. And then really, like, I do them, and I can do that with discipline. But really, when I really stick to an exercise is when a few days later I'm like, oh my gosh, like the shoulder pain doesn't, like like it's better. It's like, oh, I have much more mobility. I was like, wow,
Yeah.
it was from that one thing, right? And then it's this little unlocked factor to where it's like, oh, it's like it actually does work, right? Which you believe, but when you feel it, it's different, right? So I think shortening the distance to that first payoff is actually really important.
Yeah.
If you're trying to teach or learn fitness or really anything, it doesn't always work out that way, and there's
Mhm.
certainly a a mindset of, well, like, if you're hungry enough, you'll get it. But once again, there are like, do you want to help, or do you want to like gatekeep it? Right. And I mean, like, both might be valid, because you like, so there are certain things you might be like, well, this is something that I want for myself. But if you want to share with other people, then we have to try to make it a little bit easier. There's a flag. That's
Yeah.
why I opened the window.
I definitely see both sides of it. Like you create this resource for people to use for free, and
Mhm.
they can take it and they can run with it and they can change your life forever. And I also know that some people need to pay in order to pay attention, right? Like
Right.
so it's almost like sometimes you need to put a small
Yes.
hurdle for them to jump to actually gain their attention, right? So
Right.
I see both sides of that. In the rehab space, one of the cool things that I like to do is exactly. This actually happened not too long ago. I hosted a 3 day webinar, and somebody had a shoulder replacement, and a bunch of physical therapists and acupuncturists like basically gave up on her. They're like, we don't know what to do with you. Your pain doesn't make any sense. And all I did is I went back to the basics. I was like, okay, take this little lacrosse ball. You're gonna dig it into your rotator cuff until it feels like it's less sensitive, and then go ahead and do your exercises. And she like almost instantaneously made more results that she did in 1 hour than everything she'd done before. And that quick win that she got, she was floored. She was hooked. She actually had an outcome, or I should say, she saw light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. Um, do you have any quick win strategies that you would use with your clients?
Oh, well, it really depends on what they want or need, right? So
Mhm.
if it's just honestly, for a lot of people watching who may not have actually, if you haven't committed to an exercise routine in a while, and you find a good one that's intense, you can notice, you can see, like, you wouldn't think so, but you can be able to see benefit and changes in your body within a couple of days. Right. Now, how quick do you want it? Because like, something that I call, some people refer to as the isometric immediate after effect, right? To where if you do it like an overcoming isometric, you get like a small strength boost. Now, it depends on the person, right? And my theory is that the more advanced you are, the less you need that, because like you're already used to activating the fibers. But some people is pushing or pulling as hard as you can on something, and then doing it can often improve your performance at that just for a couple of seconds. So like trying to push or pull on something, if you think of a pull up, before you do the pull-ups, people can like, oh, I have a couple extra pull-ups from that. It's not, I didn't make you that much stronger. It's just like, that's essentially a high intensity warm up after you do your regular warm up. So something like that. But really, I think that stuff is cool, and it's neat. But really, if you have an effective method and you spend your time trying to hone your method and trying to adapt it to different people, when they have that first thing, those first 1, 2, or 3 sessions can really make a big difference, because I think it's important to set a foundation for people to drive themselves, right? And it's almost, it's almost like how people are addicted to some things, right? To where like sometimes the quick win is misleading for us. You do one thing and it works, and that's great. I'm going to tell everyone, and then a couple months later, you say, "Is that thing still working?" And they're like, "Oh, not really." Is that right? It's like, but they're still hooked on it. They're like, "No, no, no, it did it. It worked that one time. It worked that one time. It did, right?" So, but we want to find something healthy, something that's actually good and sustainable and progressive long term. And we give someone, give this thing to someone, and they say, oh, "Okay, interesting. This stuff works." And because of that, here's a path, a roadmap that can work for years and years and years, possibly the rest of my life.
Yeah. You're setting them up for the long term, and you're teaching them the why behind it. Because
Right.
what I do in rehabilitation is like, yeah, I'm going to help you move and feel better. And to your point, that overcoming isometric also can help with joint pain, tendon pain, and things like that as
Yeah.
well. So if that's limiting them in their workout, I've seen people with like pretty bad tendon pain just they get through the workout pain free because of the isometric. So everyone that's listening, put that in your back pocket.
Yes.
But I also wanted to ask you something. So
Sure.
when you are working with somebody, because with my rehab, I'm always thinking about how can I build uh, self confidence and autonomy, if you will. Like, how can you do this on your own and feel confident about it? But you mentioned like here's the intro video with education, right? It's almost like you're feeding somebody vegetables that they want to eat. Um, how do you go about that? Like, how are you going about teaching people about exercise, but in a palatable way?
So we talked about this a little bit before the call, but I think I tried. There's a couple different layers to that. First is I try to make the slope as smooth as possible. So it's just like you're always able to take the next step. So it's like, hey,
Mhm.
if you don't want to watch the 2 minute video, right? And I say that laughing a little bit. Some people may have reasons they don't want to watch it, but like for most people, you can usually watch a 2 minute video to learn. If you don't want to watch it, here is a 3 sentence paragraph, right? If you don't want to read that, here are the pictures, right? So I try to make that as smooth as possible for different people because there might be reasons, right? Some people may not learn as well through video, of course, right, or like through audio. So I try to give it a different. I try to make it more progressive. And then if you want to watch this, then you can watch the 3 minute one. Then you can watch the 10 minute one, an hour long one, and then you can really go into it. So I try to make it like that, so you can just like go as far as you want. And
Mhm.
then usually, if it's a journey, like for example, if you if you give them a workout routine and then they just skip the part about technique, and then later on you mention it during some of your things, like, and then they'll go back. They're like, now that's more relevant, right?
I
Because
see.
I, see, before I got into fitness, before I got into this side of fitness, I still worked out. And I don't know if people will relate to this because I thought it was really relatable the first time I heard it. But it was a episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine where Jake said like, "Well, I'm I I was working on my delts today, right?" And Terry goes like, "Jake, point to your delts," and he's like, "Right here." Right, and it made me laugh because I was like, "That's right. Most people don't really know where a delta. I didn't know what a delta. Like I looked it up before. I was like, okay, shoulder muscles, interesting, right? But I didn't really stick until I started working my deltoids. I'm like, okay, interesting. Now that I'm using it, now that it's immediately helpful, now I probably hopefully never forget what a deltoid is, right? So like because and so if you make the introduction slope not that steep, right, to where they can get into it and they just get started, then they can pick out different things that they want later on as they become more relevant, right? And I also try to do it in different formats. Some people want video, audio, or words.
This reminds me of like when I was in chemistry class, like
Yeah.
the whole time I couldn't get over the fact that like the overarching question, I'm like, why am I here? I don't want to learn this. I'll never use it in my life. But I feel like if I took that class a little bit later in my educational career, I can actually see the application of it and like maybe I should pay attention instead of
Right.
just trying to like squeak by. Yeah, I didn't really think about it like that. Maybe well, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm gonna start looking at my coaching style and wondering if I'm putting the cart before the horse, right? Like I'm talking about reps in reserve, and they don't even know what a rep is. Maybe I should pump the brakes a little bit, you know?
Right. Well, I think it's really when they can start using it and seeing it, and understanding what it is behind it. And I mean, it applies to a lot of different things. Like when you and I started, I and we looked into social media dashboards on social media. I saw views, and that's kind of what I understood. I didn't understand like watch time or retention or anything. It wasn't useful until I was like, oh, interesting. This is actually really important. How much it spreads. This is how much so like I think that's how it is. So like short intro, like easy way to get started. Give you what you need. Later on, you can start to understand this. Like, okay, so reps in the reserve. You do this and you do this, and they might still be bored. They might not care. The people have to kind of choose their own adventure, so to speak. But there are some foundational things to where, yeah, I think that's a good thing that everyone can try to do. I'll try to do that too. Where if someone has, because you have to strategically put it at a place to where it comes up, kind of like a video game, right? It's just like you don't need a tutorial for something you're not going to get for hours and hours and hours, right? Later on, it's like, okay, interesting. Do you want a reminder on how to use this? Like, yes. Right, so it's like you kind of like touch on the reps and reserve thing, and then when you're coaching them, it's like, do you remember when we talked about this? And they said no, or like they say yes, and you're like, do you really? And like, no, right? That's it. and then they can be like, it's okay. Most people don't care, right? It's like here's what it is, and here's why it matters. Here's a chart, and here's something you can do at home. Like that can work. So strategic moments to where it does become applicable, because again, they may not ask.
Mhm.
Right. They might think you think they're stupid, or they might think that, it doesn't matter at the moment. Right. So you kind of have to pick and choose.
Yeah. When it comes to your approach to fitness and all that, and somebody's trying to get started, I know a big part of it. I mean, we kind of talked about this off air. Is kind of like community, and I've noticed that with your videos and all that, there's a solid amount of community. Like there's people talking to each other, they're resonating with your content, and I guess my question would be is like how much importance do you put on community, and how important do you think it is for long-term success when it comes to fitness?
From the perspective of the student, right?
Yeah,
Person learning.
exactly.
I think it depends on the person, right? Because and I think it can be very important to have a community around you that is pursuing the same goal as you, right? So it's like, let's say that you are trying to start a YouTube channel, right? It's like you want other people, ideally, you want other people around that you can talk with. You're learning to sing, you're learning to play violin. It's like, well, hey, I'm having this issue. Like, I'm trying to get through my passaggio, but it's going flat. Someone's like, okay, I have that issue too, and they can share. So that's the idea of community, right? You can share knowledge, you can give knowledge. That can be really important to some people. But people also learn in different ways, right? So like when I work out, I never really worked out with someone, right? I did that kind of, right, but it kind of. I'm sorry to all the people that I worked out with. It kind of just got in the way of what I wanted to do, right? It's like I just want to do this, and then I want to think about this, and I want to, and like I don't even listen to music. People get said like you're a psychopath because I don't listen to music, I listen to podcasts. I just want to focus on the thing, right? I just want to focus on the thing. I go all in on that, right? Right, and sometimes I just want to spend that extra little bit of brain energy, like imagining my muscles moving, right? Because I was like, I want to feel connected there, like interesting. So that's how I am, right? And there's a lot of different things to where I very occasionally, sometimes want to reach out and, hey, there's a question I have on this, on like, like especially newer things, like, okay, interesting. So like, if we're loading the front lever, we want to do this, so you want to plan sheet, like, okay, interesting. So this progression is that's good. And uh, Ido Portal actually talked about learning the one arm handstand once, and he has a lot of like obscure forum posts that I kind of wish there was more of a centralized thing, but it's not. It's not really what he does. There's forum posts where he talked about learning the one arm handstand. He said this little girl learned the one arm handstand in like a couple of years, where in the past it would have taken someone years and years and years as an adult. And it's because through time and community, we have shared knowledge of what works and doesn't work. Right. So this is a potential pitfall of calisthenics in general, where we haven't done that with the same rigor that probably like weightlifting with barbells and dumbbells have. Right. There's a lot of things that do work, but which ones work better? Right.
I see.
We haven't really gone through that. Like there's some like experiential knowledge, which is good. And I don't think we need. I just want to know what works, right? Whether it's documented in a study or like it's just well established through, and especially if you can reason it out. Because, for example, going to calisthenics a little bit. So, like when you do things like the back lever, the front lever, the planche, even the elbow lever, even the human flag, there's usually a tuck variation, and that usually means you're bending your legs, right? Some of those, I would say, because of joint angle specificity, may not be the most efficient way to learn the movement. They might be valid as an exercise, so I'm not invalidating that as an exercise, but they may not be the most efficient way to learn your goal exercise, right? And to that point, let's say you're trying to go from wall push-ups to full push-ups. I basically have someone start wall and then like they go down, right? And then like, the joint angle specificity there and leverage, it does change, right? So that you're not going to have, ideally it'd just be an easier version of the push-up and you have like, I don't know, like someone pulling on you, because like even using a resistance band will match the curve, but it's quite not quite the same.
Right.
You can argue different things with that. But there's a little bit of a trade-off, right? Because there are some things, and I meet this, there's a lot of people that I talk to where they're like, I want to learn the planche, right? Which is like a goal in calisthenics. And it's like, I can do the tuck planche for like 5 seconds. I'm like, it's going to be quite, you're quite far from that.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent of like benching the bar. And then your goal is benching 315.
Yeah.
I would say, it's, or like something quite like that. Now, tuck planche, can be a good exercise, right? But there are other things that might be better to where you can better match that, I would say. So like there's a little bit more specificity that calisthenics can get into.
For those who are listening that are not familiar with some of these terms when it comes to calisthenics,
Okay. Yeah.
a tuck planche is basically somebody just defying gravity completely.
Okay.
It's definitely a mind-boggling movement, and that it's perfect that it transitions to my curiosity about what is it about calisthenics for you? Because for me personally, um, it's first and foremost. Like, so I'm not that heavy, but I'm like 6 foot.
Yeah.
205
Yeah.
and
You're built.
pull-ups are miserable. Well, they really challenge me. I still have them in my routine. But then again, like during the 2020 like COVID season, like I was doing nothing but calisthenics, and I just felt like because of my levels of calisthenics were so low, I didn't have enough variety. And I'm just curious, like, where do you fall on that? Why do you like calisthenics so much?
Honestly, it was just where I was in the journey when I started, right? So that was like I had been there was the call to adventure I had, right? And I started learning about calisthenics. My workout routine before I really started studying was just 6 sets of 82 push-ups a day. So that was like 496 push-ups, right? Right. And I was like, 'cause I didn't know much, right? I was just like, I know push-ups are good, right? I'll just do them, right? And I try to do them throughout the day, and like that was almost 500 push-ups a day. It was okay, right? It was okay, but like I really did need some balance, right? And I like the idea that the key to that there's a key within us attached to us that we can get healthy, fit, and strong. Pretty much attached to us. We have that attached to our bodies, right? Yeah. If you want to bench press a certain amount, by all means, bench press, right? Because there's a specific strength there, right? But just getting to the point where you can do some of these pretty cool calisthenics moves, you usually have to be pretty fit and strong, right? And you can build up to that with just your body. And I thought that was really interesting. That's why I wanted to teach it because like where why I probably ended up doing hybrid calisthenics not wasn't because it was such an interest to me. It was because I was shown these easier variations in a way that was new to me. I was like, interesting, right? That was kind of where the magic is, and that's kind of I think what I eventually shared with a lot of other people. Is like interesting that you can do this because it's something my mom could do, right? Something
Yes.
my girlfriend, she's a wife now, but girlfriend at the time she can do. So those were the first people I trained was my mom and my girlfriend, and like this classmate that I had. I was like, interesting. Because prior to that, it wasn't really explained to us that you can start with a wall push up and work your way up to like a full push up. Right. It's because like once again, there's a lot of things we take for granted because a lot of fit people they don't care about. They're just like just do the push-ups, right? And then like in gym class, it's like you can either do the full push-ups or you can do the girl push-ups. And all the guys are like, oh, I want to do the full push-ups, right? Um, and it wasn't really an easier variation or harder variation. But imagine if you went to a gym and the weights were welded onto the barbell. It's like you can either do 100, you can either do 225 pounds or you can do the girl bench press, and that's 135 pounds, right? And it's like, what about all the things in between, right? And like that's not even the easiest bench press, right? There's like easier ones, there's harder ones. So like, why is that one this and this that? So I think that was what I found interesting about calisthenics. If I were to rename it now, I think I don't know. It could be hybrid. It really could just be Hampton, right?
Yeah.
I do like that I ended up with a brand name that wasn't just my name because I don't want to make it about me necessarily. But if you watch my content nowadays, some of it is calisthenics, but a lot of it also just involves around human movement, right? And that's what I like. Is like we get people moving, but I do like the implication of calisthenics that the things that a key to freedom, which I would consider to be physical freedom, is attached to us, and we can just unlock that with a little bit of knowledge and some inspiration.
A lot of my understanding as a rehab clinician actually started when I was an exercise science major in undergrad,
Okay.
where just understanding how to modify movement and disperse stress that allows you to build capacity and recondition an area that is once injured. I mean, like, for example, okay, you have some knee injury and we have to start loading that knee joint. What can we do if you don't have any equipment? By simply widening out your stance and making it a sumo squat, now it's more hinge dominant. We're taking pressure off that knee. And now you're exercising, but we're not agitating the knee. And then over time, we have the option of either adding a little bit of load or bringing those feet a little bit closer to make it a little bit more knee dominant than hip dominant.
Right.
And and that's what I saw with your content was just like, Holy crap, Hampton's teaching people how to rehab their body. And to your point, that is freedom. That is physical freedom.
Right, right. No, that is really enjoyable. I'm interested in your take on this as someone with your background.
Mhm.
When you have someone do this, and you kind of answered my question after it popped up. There's kind of a theme in like rehab social media right now, where it's not addressing something versus avoidance, but versus how you address it. So like someone with knee pain, right? I
Mhm.
feel like there's a theme of people who they want to address that more directly, so they would do close to a full bend, but it's their version of modifying that is
Yeah.
assistance, either with arm or if it's very strong, then you can like lower weights
Yeah.
versus less knee bend, more knee bend. Like what is
Yeah.
your view on that?
The way that I like to approach a lot of rehab is we have to go off of symptoms, of course. If I were to put it into a simplistic nutshell, is let's let things calm down and then reintegrate movement. So if you come to me with a flared up symptom, you're swollen, okay, we're going to work out the body in a way that the symptoms are still going to regress. So that can be all right. If you have a meniscal injury, usually that's a compression exercise, or when you do compression exercise, it hurts the knee.
Okay.
However, we can typically get away with some leg extensions depending on the tear,
Okay.
right? So we're still building up the quad, yet the knee isn't going to be more swollen than it was when it started. And then because I'm building up the quad, when we start to reintegrate, let's say squatting again, you have this inherent increased buffer of strength that will protect the knee moving forward. So I guess where I stand is how are you adapting to the movement? If this movement is provoking symptoms, remove it for now. Find what we can do, and then as symptoms become normalized, let's experiment and add a movement back in and see what happens. And of course, that's going to be dependent on somebody's goal as well. Like if their goal is like, I mean, they should have a goal to be able to sit from a chair and stand from a chair, but
All right.
of course, everything past that is just like, well, if you don't want to push a certain amount of weight above your head, then we don't have to do that. But that's kind of how I would approach it. I don't know if that answers your
No, and
question.
to answer my question beautifully. I love that. I would love to see that in like a short form video. Right, because then I can send to my no, you should take exactly what he said to me, make it a short form video, and then I can send it to my friends because that kind of ties into a similar thing to where I was talking about before. It's like there's different ways to progress of movement. Which one's better, right?
Yeah.
So let's say to use the example of calisthenics a little bit, push up. So you can just like assist the push up movement, or you can start vertical and go a little more horizontal. Which one's better? And your answer, which I think is great, it makes a lot of sense, and I've heard before, but I think you explained it very well just now. Is what depends on the limiting factor. Right, and then you say like symptom, but like it depends on the limiting factor, right? Because like
Right.
there are some where you would want to assist, but there are some where you want to train a movement from basically a different angle, right? So you can still exercise,
Yeah.
but we're doing that while we're healing this thing, right? And
Yeah.
and here's why one's better than the other, and here's how you can know. If you can summarize that in 30 seconds, I think it'd help a lot of people.
See, this is why I need to get like succinct like you. I mean, maybe I got to write it down. The one thing that I think is very cool. And when I watch your content, I feel like you follow a principle based approach where it's just like if you follow, I think that's with a lot of things that I ask you. I don't ever hear you saying things one way or the other. It's always like, well, and then you kind of go through this thought process, and I'm assuming you're using guiding principles to kind of answer these questions. And that's kind of how I would use or how I approach rehab, where it's like, do we do this or this? Well, we know that XYZ will happen, therefore we can do these one or two things. And I'm just curious, like, do you have that type of approach when it comes to, let's say, building out your programs for hybrid calisthenics?
I would say that I think principle is very important to have. So there's a saying. So I'm going to say a saying. Okay, and then I'm going to push back against my own saying. Where having a technique is like having a key, and understanding the principle is like having the master key. There's different variations of that saying. Some might say not technique and principle, but I think they work well here. So I think if you understand the underlying the foundation of something, then you can understand how it applies to different things. So I always try to go to a foundation. I would try to go to a principle. Now, an issue with that is, first of all, there are many things to where that may not directly apply. I might understand the principle of MMA. Okay, but if I haven't practiced the techniques, I'm probably gonna get beat up. Right. So right. So you have to understand the principle and really hone the techniques. Right. So there's that. And then there's also sometimes where your principle is flawed. Right. So there's we've seen this develop through exercise science, even as I mean, something as simple as knees over toes. Right. How we approach that. Right. The study itself about like more like like basically more knee bend is like more pressure on knee. I that makes sense. But our interpretation of that and our approach to that, I feel like has changed over the past few decades. Right.
Yeah.
And maybe even less, you know, like more acutely. So I think if we follow a principles based approach, we will have it's cool because it's like a lens to where you can view different things and you can say like, oh, this is the answer, this is the answer thing. So this is why I have a lot of I take a question or a concept and I break it down to different steps because I'm putting that lens through there. However, sometimes we should be open to the idea that our lens needs to be cleaned or polished a little bit, or because our principle might not, it usually isn't completely different, but it could be tweaked a little bit to where it's like interesting. So like imagine if exercise wasn't progressive, but it was like there were different phases to where like kind of like how periodization is to where it's like you don't have to like smoothly slope it. Sometimes you got to add in some randomosity to where you can do this. This is me completely just BSing, to be honest, right? But it's like imagine like the different concepts were improved to where it's like interesting. So this because my principle was wrong, my program was wrong, not completely wrong. It still worked. That's interesting. Right. But now we can tweak it a little bit. Wow, that makes a lot more sense. And it's always like, wow, I always knew that. Why didn't I think about it? So like these are things that I always try to revisit. Is I try to poke holes in my own theories, right? And like honestly, that makes me sound smarter than I am. So you know, but when I say something, I do try to question it a little bit. So and that's why I do kind of go to the first part of your the podcast. I do speak in I speak in long paragraphs, right? Because
Yeah.
I like to add all the details right there. And
Same.
my answer usually is it depends, because most things depend, right? Now that does affect something, because that's something that I had to be a little bit careful with. Not careful with, but I realized that sometimes being more accurate would undermine my own words, right? And there's a trade off there, right? Because it's a lot more impactful, right? If I can say things like, this is wrong, you should never do this. And that might apply to some things, right? Here's where, and getting into teaching and learning, I think, because people can identify this when others are trying to teach them. This is why I think certain teachers, not in fitness, just in general, just people who have taught things in the world, they have seemed very convincing and very charismatic when they can distill down their concepts and say very confident things, right? But the thing there, the principle there, is that just because someone is saying confident things doesn't mean they know what they're talking about, right?
Very true.
That's the thing. It's just because like someone who's very good can say things very confidently, but those confident words have been put through the ringer 1000x, right? To where it's just like no. Like the reason why like E equals MC squared is a very short thing, right? And I don't even know enough about physics to like really. I certainly not to poke holes in Einstein, right? But I know some people have questions about that, but it's like the fact that you can distill it down to something that simple actually is the result of starting very wide and then going narrow. Not like this is the limit of my knowledge, right? Right. So like someone that's a little more controversial, but speaks in a very convincing way, I would say is Mike Menser. Right. So I do
Mhm.
like some of his training philosophy. I think a lot of people do. That's why it's stayed. Right. But then so there's different ways you can look at it. You can say this thing was definitely wrong and Mike would have changed his mind. You can say this is definitely wrong and he was being a charlatan. I don't know. Or you can say his interpretation of people misinterpret what he means. Different ways to view that. But he was someone who, even if some of his theories were, they're given different lens now. Some people don't like, they like volume more than intensity, things like that. He at the time I think it was clear he knew what he was talking about, right? Like if nothing else, then through the results, you can say he used steroids. A lot of people use steroids. He was the reason. There's a reason Mike Mentor is Mike Mentor, right? So I thought that was very interesting, and he spoke in a way that was very convincing. He spoke in a way to where it was clear that he had knowledge on the things he was talking about. Once again, some of the knowledge you can say was later proven wrong, but at the time he had knowledge about it and he spoke in a very convincing way. He was someone who had done, he had really read the research on that and used it in a way that benefited him and hopefully benefited others. That's an example of someone that's more controversial, less controversial. The thing is, like, he's not alive now to defend himself, right? So
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's like he might say, "Oh yeah, that was wrong." You know, he might say that. So like, so all the people that were arguing he was right, it's like, well, maybe we should, is that right? Or it might be like, no, this is wrong. This is what I actually meant. Right. So I'm not sure, but that's an example of someone that pops to mind who speaks very succinctly, kind of like the opposite of me. Right. Like if you were to do like a speech of Mike Mentzer's versus a speech of mine, I might do it in a way where I hedge my bets a little bit more and like might last for longer than Mike Mentzer because I hedge so many of my bets. I'm like, well, it depends, right? So it might work for some people, it might work for like saying like this might work for some people, might not work for other people applies to so many things. It's accurate, but does it get anyone's attention? Right. So I
Yeah.
think as teachers and students, as a teacher, we have to strike the balance between confidence and saying something that's still correct, but succinct in a way that people can understand and impacts them and inspires them and motivates them and educates them. All of that. That's the
Yeah.
responsibility. And as students, we have to distinguish the difference between someone being confident because they know what they're talking about and someone being confident because that's the extent of their knowledge.
You mentioned the book is in the works. It's coming out.
Yeah.
Now, how would people find you? What would be the best way that they would follow you?
I try to, like many people, I try to follow my own principles and my own teachings, and I fail somewhat, right? So I try to be everywhere to be accessible to people where they want. I try to meet them where they're at, right? So I am Hybrid Calisthenics on almost all major social media platforms. I'm on, I think, all major social media platforms, depending on what you consider major. So YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, um, X, which I still sometimes call Twitter, Tumblr, right? It's like we're all the places. Hybridcalisthenics.com is where you can find the free fitness routine. But honestly, I say this all the time. If it's a difference between you, you know, like 'cause a lot of people think like they get energized by a podcast. Like this is cool. I want to do this. If it's a difference between you following me and me having one extra follower, which by the way, love it. Thank you so much. But if it's a difference between that and you saying, well, I'm gonna, you know, there's a video on like an exercise routine that I already like that I want to watch, and you watching that and taking steps and investing in yourself, do that. And then you can always come back and follow me later. Right. So I would say like because people get energized and they have that 30 minutes, an hour of motivation, go do that. And then if you really like it, then you can go back and you can follow me. You can find me on different things, is what I would say.
Awesome.